Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Coolbaugh. Today, I have me a very special guest, Tatiana Ob. Tatiana, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, like I said before we got recording, I was really excited when I saw your, cover for your duology. I was like, that's my type of fantasy. I got to get that author on. So I was not it wasn't earth shattering when I had somebody bail out, and I was like, well, I'll just try and get a hold of Tatiana, try and get her come on, a few months earlier. So I'm so happy that we could do that and get you on today, particularly after I checked out your website in more detail and checked out your world a little bit more and the reviews. So really excited to get my Amazon Kindle card like I normally do for Christmas because you're very high on my list. So thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, we'll get started right now. For that first question, which is always a fan favorite, one of my favorites, what has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Okay.
I know it's
Well,
hard.
I well, I am one of those authors like many who started writing when I was very little. So I would go in elementary school, like having my friends help me write the stories and it's like, oh, what should my characters do here? What should our characters do here? Like based on Pokemon and Dragon Quest and stuff. So I was at it when I was little.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, but I really wrote my first full-length book in high school.
Oh, wow.
I even did my senior thesis about traditional publishing and how to apply to traditional publishing. I got my first query rejection as a part of that process, so that
Oh,
was a
that's
lot
awesome.
of fun to do.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But I was kind of wrote this book all through high school, and when I hit college, I was tired. So I started writing fan fiction in college because I'm just that type of person that needs to write, right? Um, and I do recommend fan fiction to a lot of like up and coming writers. It did help me a lot with my craft because it is different when you finally show people your work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think I exponentially improved at that time. So for example, it like showed me what I was strong at. I knew I was strong at world building. I knew I was strong at characters. It showed me what I was weak at, pacing, my common word problems that always get messed up, and also how to anticipate readers' expectations. So there's a lot of things you can learn in regards to craft with fan fiction. But after college, I tried brushing off that old story from high school, but I found that I had kind of outgrown the story. And sometimes you outgrow stories.
Yeah.
The plots and twists that kind of had excited me before had just seemed more juvenile and uninteresting. So I decided to shelve that book. After that, I started a new story with the specific intention of trying to pursue traditional publishing. But unfortunately, I was unsuccessful at querying it. And I think because I at that point I knew I was a good writer from fan fiction, from hearing, like other people said saying. So I was trying to figure out why isn't this connecting? Like, why is it not connecting with the industry? And I kind of decided that no matter how many concessions I made or how much I sacrificed to fit into those boxes, that the stories I enjoyed telling didn't really fit with traditional publishing.
Mhm.
Um, and so once I had that realization, I realized that if I was ever going to succeed being an author, I would have to cultivate my own audience. And that's when I decided that I was going to self-publish. And at this time in my life, I had worked in marketing. Indie publishing was a lot more viable. So I felt like I had the skills to do this on my own. So I was like, okay, I think I got this. I think I can do that. And that's how I decided to self-publish. So once I decided what I was going to do, I kind of considered what type of story I should write to introduce myself to the genre. It is kind of important, to decide on your debut novels. Like this is what I
Yeah.
stand for. This is what you're going to expect from me going forward, right? Kind
Yeah.
of sets the tone of your career. So my decision was to go back to that story I wrote in high school. Because even though I had outgrown the story, the characters had stayed with me throughout the years. So I really wanted to finally write a story that did those characters justice. So I crafted a better plot around the characters. I strengthened the themes that my teenage self kind of struggled to convey. And it really kind of became a story that metaphorically reflected my coming of age experiences as a Black woman in America. Also, in addition, because I am a contrarian, I decided just to go all out and write a story that traditional publishing wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So, like, this is a book that traditional publishing, you wouldn't see it in traditional publishing. It, if Also, so it's like, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So finally, after years later, after I had conceived these characters, I felt like I finally had the craft and the skill to tell this story. And sometimes you're not ready, and
Mm.
sometimes you are. But even then, insecurities and doubts kind of had me putzing over the manuscript for a few years. And it really wasn't until the pandemic where you kind of like hitting your face, like, oh no, what if something happens? What if I never get to tell my stories?
Yeah.
And I finally kind of had to let that perfectionism go. So I buckled down, I self-published, and I self-published my first book, Bones to the Wind, my debut novel, in March of this year. So that has been my writing journey so far. So here is my first novel, Bones to the Wind. And the second one came out in November 1st. So the duology is complete.
Awesome. I love those covers. I can't get over them. Like they're very like my kind of they're my kind of fantasy. Like from
Yeah.
cover, yeah, like when I was reading, your blurbs, I was just like, yep, 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 like check, 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 check. So yeah, they both look fabulous. I was very intrigued by both characters. Um yeah, in different ways, but I was just like, oh, those are really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you said a lot of really cool things there. One thing I love that you said was anticipating readers' expectations. So I definitely wrote that one down for myself later. I'm gonna have to think on
Yeah.
that one. I think that's a good one to point out to people that, maybe we don't think about that enough,
Yeah. Because there's one thing that you do get with fan fiction, and you're publishing a chapter by chapter and you're hearing people's responses, right? Unlike a novel where you're writing the whole story and then you put it out. So it did begin to train me to have an ear of, I know what these readers are expecting, I know where this is going, and I know how to pull the rug under your feet.
Write that down. I keep forget. I feel like I used to write fan fiction like back in the day, and that's really where like a lot of my fantasy world came from. Because I
Mhm.
was like I said before we got recording, I really loved like Robert E. Howard's like concepts. I loved using history, but just making it. I love sword and sorcery. I think growing up on, just so many cool, movies and TV shows.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like the era for it. But like Forgotten Realms was one, Dragonlance was another one, and I just was like, I used to do stories in those worlds, and back in the day, people used to, or back when they were Wizards of the Coast, like way
Mhm.
back, or TSR or whatever, like you could actually write a story in their world, and then if they liked it, they'd give you a publishing
Oh,
contract.
yes, I remember. Yes.
Yeah, so I like had so many. I was 14. I first discovered them, so I was like I was writing, writing, writing. So I think that's really the only fan fiction I've done. But you're like one of I think 20 authors that have told me that that was really helpful. And I'm like, there's so many things that I love. I'm like, I think that's gonna. I've been thinking about doing that this summer as my writing exercise each day. It's like picking something that I'm currently on, whether or not it's like I really love like Morrowind and like Oblivion. I think that
Hmm.
would be, like a really fun fan fiction, to write. But I feel like left out because I don't think I really did. Like Star Wars, I think would be a good one, like you gotta take all that knowledge, right, and put it
Yeah,
somewhere.
that's true.
But I like how you said that. I didn't consider that, in terms of getting that feedback right away. And yeah, following those reader expectations. I think that's a really good point that I had not thought of before when it came to fan fiction. So yeah, that's good. To think about that later on. I always love talking to writers and authors before and artists and things before. Love interviewing people before my writing session starts because it's kind of like a warm up in itself, because your brain always gets going, and I always get something great out of some of our any of our guests, so it's awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm really really curious now that we've
Mhm.
talked a little bit before we start recording and now. Um, for that second question, what exactly drew you to this current genre and what keeps you here?
So I currently write secondary world fantasy, so it will always be a different world. I don't really write contemporary fantasy or urban fantasy. It's always something different. And I grew up with fantasy, like whether watching Dragon Ball Z with my dad or, picking up my first fantasy novel, Dragons of Autumn Twilight.
Oh
I
my
just,
God, I love that book.
me too. I've
Oh,
read them all.
just a masterpiece. Like the second one was great too, third, but like that first one was just like the cover, the yeah, just like how they
Yes,
get
in the
onto the
cover.
adventure.
Yeah, I still remember that moment in like middle school and the book fair and seeing that book. I was like, that one.
God, such a great book. Oh, I wish I had seen that at a book fair. I remember being at the first time being at oh now they're closed, like the offshoot of Borders where they were Walden's books. And I remember
Hmm.
like first walking into Walden's books and I think it was like in like seventh or eighth grade when I picked that up. I was like, oh, this looks really cool. Yeah, that's a great book. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
blame
So,
you there. Second world fantasy. I mean, my friend and I, we talk about it all the time. Like, I do love urban fantasy.
mhm.
I've been getting more into reading that the last several years and writing that as well. I wish I could write sci-fi. It's hard for me. But second world fantasy seems to be my thing. I think it's just, I'm a teacher, so I feel like, it's hard sometimes to write about the real world because there's great things, but there's not great things, and I think I just have to deal with that so much. I feel like second world fantasy is just it's so much fun, right? Because you can literally just take anything and create anything,
Yes,
and
yes.
yeah, and then when people think it's cool, you're just like, I did it, like
Yeah. I
it's such a
love the imagination. So
yeah. I
just
think that's a good way to put it.
creating.
Yeah. Cultures and peoples and like I have a gaming group, so they've been playing in my world, my fantasy world, and they're like, oh, this is so cool, and I'm
Super
like.
fun.
Yeah, I'm like I've been because I wanted to do my own game for a while and like graphic novel and stuff for years and um that's like one of the things that I was thinking about doing and it's nice, right? Because you get to speaking of like fan fiction, like I can propose something and they can tell me instantly if they liked it or not, and
Yeah.
I it
And it's a
I
very clever way to like figure out like what the broken rules are.
yep. No, seriously,
Where you need
yeah,
to fix
no, yeah.
things.
Yep. I highly recommend it for anybody. It is really, really fun, and it's my first time like being the dungeon master and stuff. And I don't think I'm like the best DM because I kind of skip some of the things. I'm just like whatever. I like help my players out a lot. I'm more concerned about the story, and we do like
Yeah.
my friend gave me the idea. We do story points. So let's say like you did something really cool this session. So next time I'll give you a story point. Well, if your guys' back is to the wall or something like that, and you're down to like one health or hit point or whatever, and then you come up with a really good story about how you got out of the situation, or whatever, I'll let you use your story point, and it's like a get out of jail free card.
Oh,
And
that's so
it
fun.
just, oh, I'm so glad my friend suggested it. It has been the greatest writing tool. So then, once I get done with the session, then I come home and then I like start writing about it, and it's been like really, really super helpful. Kind of makes it come to life and it's cool to see your characters, that you create in different races and things and cultures and to see your players go with that and then add to that. It's been really fun. I highly recommend it. It's been one of the greatest writing exercises I've ever done. So yeah, but I think it's
Yeah.
because it's second world fantasy. It just makes a lot more fun. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So like I really like grew up with just a lot of fantasy around me and I just absolutely love exploring different worlds.
Oh yeah.
So that's the same experience I try to emulate in my books, right? I also tend to lean more towards sword and sorcery grimdark side of things rather than the epic fantasy side of things. I remember having like a significant light bulb moment when I first picked up The Black Company by Glenn Cook, right? Have you read that book?
Oh, I busted through the first like I think that was like I reread because I was too early, I think, in my reading journey of fantasy. I tried when I was like, I think like 14, I got it from the library. And I
Mhm.
wasn't ready for Glenn Cook's style. But like 2 years ago, oh my gosh, I went and I said to my buddy, I was like, how did I not just blow through this series, back then? But I think I had to be, more in a
Yeah.
ready state. But God,
Yeah.
that's gonna be
It's
one of the
it's
best books like of all
yeah, it's
time.
so good. And
Yeah.
for the audience, the Black company is basically about the everyday struggles of a mercenary group, a mercenary company. And I feel like finally here was the type of stories that I wanted to tell,
Mm,
which is, I don't write black and white conflicts. I don't write like the big epic good guys save the world type of books. I'm more interested in telling the smaller everyday stories, right? With characters who aren't perfect, who make mistakes, and who are, morally gray.
yeah.
So, for example, in my duology, it's about a bunch of kids undergoing a dangerous rite of passage to become adults. So is the world at stake? No, but the world as these kids know it is at stake. Then
Mm.
absolutely. So I really do enjoy writing those smaller, everyday type of stories where the stakes are more meaningful and personal.
I like that. Yeah. And I feel like Sword and Sorcery is so good for that, and
Yeah.
um not that I don't like epic fantasy, but I do agree with you. Like Glenn Cook, I loved his, like his books. That's the only thing I think that's getting me through Malazan, Book of the Fallen, or like the everyday soldier stories, and
Mm-hmm.
just the everyday people. You have all these other conflicts and things going on, but it's crazy. My friends and I are like 1,200 pages, and you do have gods and different things going on, but really most of the book is 99.9% of the book is just how these people survive this harsh world and their trauma and what they do to survive it. And it's like and you just see their choices they make, good or bad. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think it definitely makes a more interesting story in the long run when you do it that way. But I think your reader can connect more with that, right? Like it might be hard to be like, oh, I have all the power of a god and how would I do this versus like somebody just your I think that's where people really connect with Harry Dresden. Is yeah, he's all powerful at the same time though he's not like a god. He's like
Yeah.
he makes a lot of silly mistakes at times, but I think Jim Butcher runs a fine line with him where he's has a lot of potential, but also is more of an everyday man. He's not like especially compared to the people that he fights, he's not a juggernaut. And so he usually barely wins. And that's why I like Patricia Briggs too with Mercy Thompson. I feel like she's a lot like that, and she gets like legs broken in one of the books and then barely survives like and she's there's all sorts of things, but yeah, I think that like everyday hero, I think a lot more
Yeah.
people relate to that. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I didn't consider that before. I have to write that down. I didn't even realize I did that actually. That's what I do. So I'm glad you said that because I didn't realize that's what I was doing. So
Yeah.
speaking of
Yeah,
reader
like I just
expectations,
read, what was the book I just read? Kings of the Wild. That one was
yeah,
great. And like despite all the monsters and stuff, it's just about a dad saving his daughter. And I'm just like, this is
yeah.
this is great.
That's on my list that's like my first one on my list. Nicholas Ames, right? First one on my
Yes.
list. He's one of my first traditional published one for 2023 that's on my list. I have a couple. I'm trying to do like three indie and then one traditional.
Same. I go back and forth between indie and traditional
Yeah,
because I like to know what's going on in both markets.
I think that's the best way to put it. Yeah, like it's really nice to know. Speaking again, reader expectation, and I think with marketing, right? If you don't know what the expectations are for the readers, in each market, but like you said,
Right.
like your story, didn't fit traditionally. Well, there's so many I've read recently I just loved where, they're like, yeah, I didn't fit in that traditional. I was like, well, that's probably why I've read a lot more indie the last, several years in particular, because I want something different. I don't
Yeah.
want that traditional, and I think that, not that, I've had traditional authors on, not that they're not doing fun and exciting things. I just think there are certain stories that, the market in a whole, doesn't buy or, want to, endorse or whatever. And, I think it's a shame because I think you get some just amazing ones. Clayton Snyder was one where I loved his River of Thieves. It was like two like bigger stories that he put in one book. And it's like, yeah, nobody wanted it. And I loved it. And then he had like one Cold West where I'm like, it's gotta be one of the best books I've ever read. So everybody should go buy it. That way I get another one from him in that world. But it's just so interesting to see, like how many different people, like there's so many different indie authors, right? Where you could write
Yeah.
a story and, those you get a huge, readership, and yet traditional publishing tells us that nobody wants your books. And it's like, well, that's clearly not true. So
Yeah.
sometimes,
Look how well Legends and Latte is doing right now.
right? Yeah. And then they came a knocking for Travis, right? And then they came a knocking. So I always think that that's so interesting. But yeah, it's interesting to see how the trends shift, from year to year with both markets. But yeah. Well, speaking of which,
Mhm.
I just want to get a little bit more, talking, about your duology.
Sure.
I'm going to kind of go off base here. I was just kind of interested where you came up with the name for your duology, Forging of Age. I was kind of curious, did it have a particular significance within the duology? Was that just kind of how what you thought to put the story under? I was just curious how you came up with that.
So the coming of age competition that these children undergo is called the Forging.
Oh, that's cool.
And the primary theme of both books is coming of age. So it's a play off of coming of age, so a
That's
forging of
awesome.
age and how these kids become adults.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why my book is extremely difficult for traditional publishing, is because it kind of starts with the YA tone, and by the end of it, it's adult. Like
Yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
kids are making adult decisions. It's really the transition.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's interesting. Amy Braun and I were just talking about that last night too, where that's like I talk about the Golden Compass on here a lot because I feel like that was a similar one too. Where the Golden Compass is a young adult, but then by the time
Mhm.
you get to the third
Exactly.
one, you're like, whoa, like
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's interesting to go there. But how did you come up with this idea, like of like the forging? I'm just curious how that idea manifests itself for you. Did you kind of pull from your own experiences and then just put in a fantasy world, or?
Well, I guess it kind of goes back to as you know, I started with the characters. I knew that I wanted to write a story about these characters, and there are some characteristics that the characters had. So, for example, the main character Raja, she's a hunter, so I have to give her something to hunt. And so I put the hunting as part of the coming of age competition because there, especially a lot of um, Black and brown societies, right, has rite of passages, and I wanted to kind of emphasize that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's yeah. I mean, I think that makes total sense. I'm sorry, I just got caught up with the name. Raj is just such a cool name. I always loved Aladdin's one of my favorite movies, and I love that tiger. That's such a cool name. Yeah, I think that it's just such a cool idea to, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because we all feel that type of longing to want to make that transition from, being a young adult into adulthood and to,
Mhm.
really put that as a rite of passage. And, I reference a lot of times in my classes because a lot of our kids, really struggle with that today. I teach eighth grade. And we talk a lot about, Native Americans and, the type of different rituals and things like that that they had, to get you into adulthood. And I think the thing that they always find interesting is that we don't have that, like here in the
Yeah,
US. Like you're a kid till you're 18, all of a sudden you're an adult. And a lot of times, I talk to different educators and things, and I'm like, I coach kids as well, and it's like I try to have a secondary curriculum for them because it's like we don't do that, and
mm,
I think it's interesting, and I do think that if you look back at those, different cultures who have done that in the past, I think it kind of helps for those stepping stones where they have more direction or know where they're going. I just think it's crazy that we do that here. Where you're like, oh yeah, you're a kid, you're a kid, you're a kid, and then you graduate in May, but you're probably 18 for that whole rest of the year, and all of a sudden you're an adult, and you're just like, what? Like, so I think it's interesting that
yeah,
you took something that everybody can relate to, but put it in a secondary fantasy setting. And show
right.
how your characters at those ages are going through the same thing. So I think that's really cool, and I love that name, the Forging. That's just like perfect right there.
Yeah, and it's very, and I did want to take like a very honest and unapologetic um approach to it. So that's kind of, if you read it, like not to exactly our modern sensibilities, right? Like this is a culture that we don't have familiarity, the reader does not have familiarity about, right? So the characters are at the age that traditionally most rite of passages happen, like really like culturally around the world. So they are
Yeah,
about
yeah.
15 and 16, but also sometimes in very adult situations, right? To think like Red Rising,
Oh yeah.
where the characters are a bit younger, but in adult situations.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think you get a lot more interesting stories doing it that way too, because somebody who, is 18 is a lot more mature than somebody who's, 12, 13, 14, 15, and I think the way that they, I clearly know because I've worked with kids for, almost half my life. I started when I was like 19, now I'm like 35. So, God, that's scary to think of. But, to see them make their, different decisions year to year, and
Right.
see, yeah. So I think that that's actually,
Yeah, and I'm like the oldest of 9 siblings.
oh, okay.
So, it is, see as my, siblings grow up and they, go through it and things. And it's like, ah.
My brother's 4 years younger than me, and sometimes over the years I'm like, God, that was dumb. Like I even told you that was dumb. And it's funny, and there'll be some things he'll say to me, and vice versa. But yeah, it is funny to see how different people react to things, at
Yeah.
different ages. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, and that idea is really in the book because many of these kids go into the foraging with their own goals, their own agendas, their own personalities, and like getting along isn't easy, and making sure they don't die even harder.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think that's totally fair. We joke about that with one of my buddies where that's just like we're always like, yeah, we just want to survive the day kind of thing.
Yeah.
We tease the kids and us, we're like, we made it, like we're all okay, and they're unhappy. We're like, no, we made it though. Like school's over now. We can all go home. Like, yeah. I
Yeah,
guess that
yeah.
makes total sense in a fantasy setting. You don't want to do the Bruce Willis and Die Hard. So that
Right.
makes
And
sense.
then I also because like I kind of threw in like a lot of ideas into it. And another one of the ideas that I come up with is that I always wanted to write the rival trope. And you
Ooh,
see the rival trope in anime more than you do
yeah, yeah,
in narrative fantasy. So, growing up with Goku versus Vegeta, Sasuke versus
yeah, yeah,
Naruto, Midoriya versus Bakugo, right? You don't
yeah.
really see female rivals. And it's like, oh, if I'm going to do a competition, I'm going to write female rivals that, push each other and are antagonist to each other, but aren't necessarily like the villains, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so I also really wanted to like put that into the story as well. So
That's a good one. I'm trying to think of a rival trope like in a book that I've read with.
yeah, there might be some in progression fantasy. I haven't read
Yeah,
much of that, but I can see how that genre would lend itself to it. But I
yeah, yeah.
haven't really read it myself.
Oh, that's interesting. Sorry, I just got to write that down for later. That's a really good point. I'm gonna have to kind of look into that because I remember like Jude Watson wrote the like Young Jedi Apprentice series when I was growing up, and I loved seeing Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon grow. And they had a
Yeah.
really great. He had I forget the kid's name, but he had a great rival. The rival trope. I mean, Jude Watson did that to a T. But yeah, I'm trying to think of a female one, and I can't think of one.
Yeah. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna write it.
Great idea. Yeah, that's excellent. I'm have to think about that now. Somebody always blows my mind with something. I'm like literally stumped right now in all the books that I've read that I can't think of. I know there's got to be one, but I think you are right though. I think the one I'm really feeling like one of the ones that I read was in progression fantasy, which I think I totally agree with you, which you know really does fit that genre. It's like the Will White Cradle series I love, where he's got quite a few of those different. I think he does rival tropes really well and kind of inserts some different ones here and there. But yeah, I can't think of a female one that I've read. So when it comes to world building, you talked a little bit about your approach,
Mhm.
but I was curious what your approach to world building as a whole was. If you start with characters, if you start with the world and a cool concept, I was just kind of curious at what your main focus was when it came to world building.
Okay. So I generally take inspiration from everywhere and everything, but what I absolutely love to do is to culture build.
It's fun.
So I love crafting an entirely different culture that often challenges the reader's way of thinking. Um, and kind of just the steps on how I do it is first, I typically choose a location. So in the book that I had originally wrote in high school, Raja comes from the desert. So I knew that I wanted to stick with that setting. So around the world, there are many deserts with their own characteristics.
Oh, that's cool.
So for the duology, I did choose the Sahara as my inspiration. And sometimes having a very specific setting in mind makes the details more realistic, as I often use the animals, the foliage, the food grown in that particular region. They feel real and connected,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Um, so for this particular book, I was both inspired and anti-inspired by Egypt. Because I think sometimes authors take world building elements from real world cultures without much thought or consideration for the
Oh, that's for
history of that
sure.
element, or of their own world building, right? So I would like to reinterpret and reimagine. So, as an example, I specifically chose not to use like hieroglyphs. I chose not to use pyramids or any other characteristics that are specific to Egyptian culture. But at the same time, I was inspired by the Nile River and how it acts, right?
Yeah.
Because the Delta informs so much of the religion, the culture, the lifestyle of ancient Egyptians. So, in that same vein, I came up with an element in my world building that can function the same way.
Mm.
So, in a 14 of Age duology, the main society lives under the bones of a massive dragon.
Oh, that's cool.
And this huge dragon informs their religion, it informs their culture, and informs their lifestyle. So it's as important to this society as the Nile is to the ancient Egyptians. So I never pluck something without thought or intention or some kind of reinterpretation, because often that is how you can do a disservice to the cultures that inspire you, especially if it's not your own.
Yeah, yeah. That's the thing that like my buddy and I have talked a lot about, in terms of um, because if you it's so hard to just go to Google and
Mhm.
look something up and then put it in without knowing, like I'm trying to the only thing I could think of is that like the only thing I can really think of is like one of my friends in the UK like accidentally did this and was like, "Oh yeah," like he was writing a story about here in the United States. He's like Indians and I'm like they're Native Americans and he's like,
Mhm.
"Well, what's the difference?" And I'm like, well, and I explained and I was like, it drives me nuts as a history teacher. I'm like, that we give this guy Columbus all this credit and he gets lost and then misnamed, puts the wrong
Yeah,
monogram of people and we keep it. But we
yeah,
know better. I'm like, it drives me nuts. And I told him, I was like, that would really throw a reader like me off. I'm like, you really gotta, think about it a little bit more. And he's like,
yeah,
fiction book. And I'm like, but I mean, I think about that all the time when you ask me that, because I'm like, well, I do really like to use different cultures. I like that's why I love your setting. I love desert setting. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just like that's my thing. I've read a lot of really cool books, fantasy books in a desert setting. Paul S. Kemp has an amazing
yeah,
series, Hammer and the Blade, set in a desert setting. It's so much fun. So Diablo 2 had a lot of things there, that were really fun. It's the best, my favorite game of all time. With Act 2, you're in the desert setting. So I think it's just one of those things. So I was looking up like veteran peoples and things like that. And I like have certain things that I thought were just so cool. But, I've been putting them together really slowly because at the same time, I'm like, well, I want to find the right sensitivity reader because I
mhm.
don't want somebody, from that region to be like, oh my God, and have it be something like, oh, Indians. And I always worry about that because I'm like, first of all, you don't want to, I've seen people just take a lot of things and craft it together without really thinking about where the
Yeah,
from and
yeah.
sometimes it's a total mess. And yeah.
And and choosing, which elements is important too.
Yeah.
So the second thing that I usually do in regards to world building is I consider what world building elements I can include that will strengthen my theme.
Mm.
So I'll give two examples from my book. So the main theme that I'm exploring in the duology is coming of age. So I consider like what can emphasize this more. And one of the choices I made was regarding pronouns. So this
Mm.
society actually has two non-gendered pronouns, one used for children and one used for adults.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
without having to state it in the text, the world building really emphasized how important it is for these kids to become adults. But
Yeah.
further, like how does these non-gender pronouns affect the way they speak to each other? How does it affect the way they think? And like one choice has further repercussions into the society that you're building. The second example I'm going to give is the use of the shroud. So in this society, all children must wear a full face shroud in public at all times,
Mm.
and they can remove it when they become adults.
Oh,
So
that's
again,
cool.
I'm taking inspiration from the hijab, but using it in a completely different way. So the question is, how did this choice where kids must wear their coverings in public, how does it change the architecture of the building? How does it change the way they relate to one another? So basically, how does these world building elements reinforce the themes that I'm trying to say? and then follow the natural ramifications that they have throughout society. So the first example I gave is a more subtle manifestation of the theme that kind of shows through the language. And the
Yeah.
second is more physical and more visual manifestation of the theme. But both reinforces to the reader that this foraging is the most important event in these kids' lives.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. Sorry. Too many
Sure.
good things were said.
Sure. And I think I guess my last world building element is I also that adds to my specific style of world building is I also really like to travel.
Hmm.
And often when you're traveling to different countries, you don't have the information on how to interact with people dumped into your lap,
That's
right?
a good point.
It's often a learning process, so, slowly gaining clarity and an understanding of different concepts and ideas and, making mistakes. I'm like, oh, okay, that's how things work. So in that same manner, I like to write a more organic world building style in regards to delivering information. So I don't actually give very long info dumps. I usually take the reader slowly through the world and so they slowly understand it and
Yeah.
completely, understand it by the end of the book.
Well, I think it's so important because I think it's like I just was listening to a podcast where they talked about this, where it's like, you know, nothing pulls me out of a book more than all of a sudden this one person being like, oh yeah, like I've lived in several different states, here in the United States, and then it's like, I have friends from different countries, so like I know certain things, but there's so much that I don't know about those areas. I might only
Yeah.
know the place where I visited or lived in Arizona, or like the kids always ask me like, "Oh, you went everywhere." I'm like, "I didn't go everywhere." I'm like, we went to these specific cities in California. I, didn't get to go to Sacramento. I didn't get to go to I went to LA, San Francisco, San Diego. And I said, but those are big cities too. I said, there's plenty of spots there that I didn't go to. And I think forgetting that sometimes and just assuming that you or I in that fantasy setting, like, oh, what's this festival? Oh, yeah, it's this, and this. And it's like, well, would the person who's coming in from a farm village for a week or whatever, a merchant would probably know that, but would a farmer coming in know
Right.
all about that? I think sometimes we info dump in ways that we forget. Like I saw someone do this recently in a book that made total sense and it was awesome. And it was like there was like this bardic like traveler, like this merchant guy kind of thing where like he's been all over. And the new Willow TV series actually on Disney Plus does this really well with one of the
Mhm.
characters, and he gets them out of where they're at. It makes total sense because he's been beyond the veil or whatever, and it's working really well, I think, for them. And he knows a lot of things to do and not to do because he's been, in all these different places. And I saw somebody do that recently with their book where I was like, oh, it makes sense that this person knows, but it is not really
Right.
info dumping. But as the conversation comes up, he's like, oh, you don't want to do that because if we say that to these people, they'll kill us. I had a bad run with them a while back, and it was very seamless, but it
Yeah, that's a
wasn't
very clever, good way of doing
right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just like, but it's not your everyday citizen knows everything. Like, they go up to this guy, like I saw one where it was not done well, and they go up to this guy and they tap him on the shoulder, and the adventurer's like, hey, what's this thing? And the guy basically knows every single thing about the whole city. And I was just like, oh no, like that probably wouldn't be a real thing, because especially the guy's supposed to be poor, right? So I'm
Yeah.
thinking, like, social class wise, like how does he know where they have to go to, to get to these spots? He's probably never going to get in past the guards for the nicer part of the city. So
Yeah.
how does he know what's there? They don't have Facebook or whatever. So
Yeah,
it always,
it's a very hard thing to do because you really have to
yeah,
decide, okay, what does the reader know? Because the reader,
yeah,
there at a certain point, the reader does certain information the reader needs to know to understand the story.
yeah, yeah,
So the question is, what are those points that what does the reader need to know, and and at what points do they need to know it, and to try
yeah,
to like naturally get it into the story.
yeah, yeah. I know some people were talking about one of my friends allegedly has a graphic organizer for this. So I was thinking about kind of making my own too,
Ooh.
like act one, two, three, and then kind of doing that as you go. And I was like, oh, I've been trying to get a hold of them. I was like, I want to see it. I'm like, that sounds like such a helpful tool to, to do that with. I have this really great essential world building blueprint and workbook from ScribeForge. It's
Mhm.
amazing, and it's just nice to have the graphic organizers, to
Yeah.
actually put down. But yeah, I think yeah, that's a great idea. I like how you
For
said that you do it around theme because I have not considered that. So I think that's a really good note to think about, because you don't want to just. I've also seen random info dumps. I'm always worried about that. I'm like, is this really something that, does my character really need to know this? Does the
Mhm.
reader really need to know this? Is this world building that's relevant to the story, or is it just like a throwaway thing that I think
Yeah.
is cool? Because I think of the throwaway things, some might stick, but a lot probably don't. So I think, your usage of doing it with theme, and maybe pulling back a little bit, I think, makes more sense because it makes it more meaningful. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And beta readers also help too. Like they're very good at catching that information. Like, oh, I didn't put that in. Okay. Oh, so okay, so that's what you need to know. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. That's excellent. That's what I've been looking for. I'm trying to find a couple beta readers who either live in the Middle East or who have been overseas, because I'm just
Mhm.
like, I'm writing this, like, my monster hunter is an ex recon marine, and he's going to have a lot of things that he did and did not like about the experience, and there's going to
Mhm.
be a thing that happens to him that makes him that really changes him and helps him deal with this trauma. And I'm like, well, it's hard because I'm like, I need sensitivity beta reader, and I also need a veteran beta reader, because I want to make
Yeah.
sure I get a lot of things right. So it's kind of hard, because then I'm like, my friend was also telling me that he did something like that recently, and it was hard because he had two different, there were a couple things that were two different opinions, and he really had to figure out the best way, to do that. But I think that, yeah, beta readers for me is like the one I'm really looking for lately. But I didn't think of that with world building, so I'm gonna have to put that down on my list for them. It's a good one.
Well, often when I have two differing opinions, I still go back to that question of theme. Which
Oh,
one strengthens the theme?
yeah,
Which
yeah,
answer or what works better for the story?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. You got me thinking about a lot today, there, Tatiana. So it'll be a good writing session for me later. I can already feel it.
Oh, good.
um, so okay, so I'm always curious. Like I said before we started recording, I'm just always so curious at how people decide whether or not they want to do a duology, a trilogy, a tetralogy, quadrilogy, whatever you want to call it, a quintet. So I'm curious as to how you decided for this particular story you're going to do a duology, and what steps you took in order to plan this duology.
Okay. Well, this answer is easy. I wrote a very long book. So I believe by the end of the book of the book, the final word count was about 310,000
Oh,
words.
wow. Okay.
Um, which, believe it or not, I'd actually gone into this to write a novella,
Oh,
like an
I've been there.
introductory chapter to these
Yeah.
characters, and that didn't happen. But I sort of kind of knew, because due to my parades into fan fiction, I do know I naturally write novels at that length,
Oh,
closer to
wow.
the 300,000 words.
Wow. Wow.
So I wasn't surprised when I finished. So I do actually have a natural length for novels, apparently. Um, but as you know, as a self-published author, we do bear all the upfront cost for editors and proofreaders,
Yeah.
who often charge by the word.
Yeah.
And I honestly did not have the money to get a novel of that length edited. So I decided to split the book into two parts with the hope that the first book could pay for the editing of the second.
Smart. Yeah, that's smart.
um, Deciding where to split the book was t- took me a while to figure out, but I kind of decided to split the book at the point where the conflict that I had introduced into the blurb, where that was resolved.
Hmm.
So the conflict introduced in the blurb, where that's resolved in the book. I kind of had a lot of anxiety about this decision in regards to splitting the book,
That's fair.
and how readers were going to react to it. And I think you can kind of see it in the reviews a little bit,
Hmm.
because like a lot of the 4-star reviews that I have, they complain about like loose ends and unanswered questions that I knew was going to be resolved in the second book. But as a debut author, you haven't really built up that cachet of patience and trust with your readers yet. And also, in addition, I do tend to play with my readers' expectations. Um, and it's not real into the second book. You kind of understand what the duology is about, because I kind of do. But luckily, most reviews for the second book is like the ending is perfect. So it is kind of like a delicate balance on deciding how I was going to approach the fact that I was going to split this book up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just always find it interesting, how people do it and how people do this, how people decide. So It is interesting. You do bring up a really good point, though. Like Brandon Sanderson talked about it in his online lectures at BYU, and he's like, he goes clearly because this was a couple years ago, like right when the pandemic like was right about to start, and he said he goes, you guys as new reader or authors probably can't write 310,000 pages and then leave it on a cliffhanger. He goes, I can, and people will buy it, and I
Yeah.
built up the reader expectation, their faith and things like that. And I'm like, well, clearly, because then now, like how much money he's going to make on books that nobody's even seen or heard the blurb of or seen a cover or anything, which
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's clear that he really made that point, I think. So I think you make a great point of, when people are trying to decide, we talked about that on here last year in particular for season one. Like, some people are like, well, I'm gonna do a trilogy because that's what I'm supposed to do. And then other people are like, well, I'm going to do a duology because that's what I want to write. And I think if you do indie publishing, I still think, it's really important for me at least, to write what you want to write. I think,
Right.
if you try, like, for instance, like, do you think that this would have worked if you had tried to, that your story would have worked if you had tried to do a trilogy? That's what I,
Um, no, because I'd written the story. Like the
yeah, yeah,
story
yeah, yeah,
was written, and it made sense to split it into 2 point parts because I felt like the books would have been too small
yeah,
in
yeah,
a trilogy. And um I think if you get the chance to read it, the natural part where it ends makes sense. It does. It makes sense. Um, but yeah, big books. But that's also why I had struggled with traditional publishing because
yeah,
to fit their word count rules, I had
yeah.
to sacrifice a lot of the world building that I like to do.
Mm,
And it was just like, oh, okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
I think that's
yeah.
yeah,
So this really allowed me to like tell the story that I wanted to tell. And
yeah,
when I had the first book out, like I did feel really anxious. I'm like, oh, I feel like it's half a story. Like, like it's not complete.
yeah.
So,
Just
but
wait.
it's nice that I had both of them basically ready to go all within the same year.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, well, that's yeah. I just always, talk to people and they're like, I really just want to do it this way, and I'm like, well, I think you should do it the way you want to do it because I think that that's the. Sometimes I think that story is almost like an organism in itself, and it's probably
Hmm.
trying to tell you like this is the story. I know some
Yeah,
people
yeah,
that they're like, I know somebody that did get a publishing contract for their quintet and they had already, written book three. They're like, oh, this is horrible. They're like, and they had to
yeah,
go back to the publisher and be like, I can write you something else after the fourth book. They're like,
yeah.
I just don't want to extend it out to five, and it's going to be a mess at that point. So
But that's one of the criticisms of traditional publishing, right? They usually do a contract for trilogies, and you get the soggy middle.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
When a book really could have been better and tighter and more efficient as 2 books.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's my biggest thing with Malazan Book of the Fallen. Like, no offense to Steven Erickson, but like, I'm like, you could probably cut out 2/3 of the
Mm.
book and it would still be the best book you've ever read. But it's like, do you really need X, Y, and Z? And
Yeah.
like the last book we did was Toll the Hounds, and it's like we got to page like 758. I remember specifically because I called my best friend and I was yelling at him. I was like, I cannot believe we're on page 758 of 1300, and he just introduced 50 new characters. And then, we got a lot of resolutions for those new characters, but not characters that we read for 8 books. Like, it drove me nuts as a writer. And I'm like, I told him, I was like, I hope I make it to the ninth, whatever, 10th, 9th or 10th one, Crippled God. Cause I'm like, if we don't get some of these resolution for these other characters that I really, have it was such an interesting writing experience that,
Yeah.
there are a
Yeah.
couple of,
It's
yeah, it gets interesting when you think about it, but.
yeah, it's funny because I haven't read them yet, and I've been, waiting to get a time to like read them all the way through. But I
um,
have heard specifically about that.
well, it's like, honestly, Dead House Gates was one of the best books I ever read. Like one of the best books, hands down. And then the third one, or was the third or fourth one, one of the greatest characters from that book series dies, and I'm like, I couldn't do it. And like, I have to say, if it was not for my buddy, like if we were not partner reading, I would have stopped with book three. It was either book three or book four, whichever
Mm.
one Midnight Tides is. It's the one before that. So I just, I don't know. Yeah, it was very hard. I recommend to everybody read it with a partner, like at least one other person. I think doing a partner read for it to me, because like it does feel like a slog at times, but
Mhm.
then you feel so triumphant when you get to the last like 250 pages. It's got to be one of the best things I've ever read. And I just want to see what his note process is like and how he sets it up. Cause I'm like, I'm having trouble with 4 characters, and he's
Yeah.
got like 60 through, 9 books. I just think an epic fantasy mind to me, just, him, Robert Jordan, and just so many people,
Oh,
just
yeah. I just got through all the Wheel of Time last year. So it's like,
oh
ah,
man.
I
That's like our
did it.
next book club thing. We're gonna do, I think, Iron Druid Chronicles in between because they're just short and sweet. And I love Kevin Hearn. He's a great guy. I met him a few years back, and I want to introduce my friend to it. I love the magic system, but yeah, like I told him, I was like, I'll wait for you. I'm on book 7 for Wheel of Time. I was like, I'll wait because I like the first 6 a lot, and I want to be
Yeah.
able to share the world building and stuff and talk to him about different things. But yeah, that's a good series right there. All right. Well, that was an excellent answer. So for number 6, I
Mhm.
gotta know, who does your covers and how did you decide which characters or scenes would be represented?
Okay, so both covers of the duology are illustrated by Asur Mazoa. And I found her through ArtStation. I found her through ArtStation. She's an amazing artist and
Oh,
she's
incredible.
extremely talented at like capturing light and movement. And
Mm,
that's kind of something that I was looking for because I knew I wanted to depict Raja on the first cover. Like it's just when you read the book, you'll understand. This is one of those characters. There's no way I could not have had her on the cover of my first book. So I needed someone who could like represent her and her spirit. And I
mm.
think the artist did an amazing job.
Yeah, I was like, let's go on this desert adventure.
Yes,
I was like,
exactly.
hold me up on that wherever you're on the sail and let's go together. Like, yeah,
Yes.
definitely, yeah. Yeah, the second one too, though. I used to teach design for a bit. I used to want to be an illustrator. I want to get back into it, so eventually, maybe in 20 years from now, I can do my own covers. But man, I can't pick if I like your first. I can't pick which one's my favorite. Like, I like both of them for a lot of different reasons. I think
Yeah.
the light with book 1, but then book 2 having that contrast with the light there on that character, and then the darkness in the back. I mean, yeah, I think that's really hard to do and get a contrast. I mean,
Yeah.
but yet the styles really match. I think that was like really hard to do, but they look
Yeah.
really great.
And because I guess I do marketing, I kind of came in with a constantly kind of just conceptual concept. Like I knew that I wanted the first book to represent day, and I knew the other book to represent night, right?
Oh, that's cool.
Um, and also, again, themes
Yeah, yeah,
to show that coming of age journey, right? The
yeah,
first book is all the fun and adventure, and then the second book is like, okay, it's getting real.
yeah, yeah. God, that's so becoming an adult. Like, you get to have fun here and now. It's darkness.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Well, she does an amazing job. I absolutely love art, and yeah, I'm gonna have to check out her art station. I mean, yeah, those were just both very incredible covers. So she does a great job. Very, very jealous there. So yeah, I like her art. I love those covers. I would say, her, Felix Ortiz, and then
Yeah, he's such a good.
oh my
He's so
gosh.
good.
Yeah, recently for people, I'm like, oh my gosh. I said to him, I was like, when I hit the lottery, can you like do my book covers? He's like, yeah, Dan, no problem. I'm like, he actually helped me a while back because we wanted to do a different banner and I wanted a particular type. And I haven't bought it yet, but I have one that we're putting together on Canva for our website. And I was like, hey, can you do this for me? He goes, it's gonna be so expensive. He goes, you might as well just it's this style of art. Find it on Adobe Reader or the Adobe whatever it is where you buy the images. He goes, just pick one of those. $10 a month, you'll get 10 images starting off. You won't even use them all. He goes, just do that. He goes, you'll save 900 bucks. And I had just randomly messaged him on Facebook, and then we became like social media friends. But yeah, he's an awesome guy. But yeah, I would say like her art's amazing. I love Felix.
Yeah, yeah,
Joel, I'm totally gonna blank on his last name. I think it's
yeah.
Machine.
And
He's really good
in
too.
one way, like I kind of, like went and cut down on expenses and things, right? Because I paid for the illustration and then I did the text myself to kind of cut down on price.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
then also I asked for the first off the hardcover spread. That is what I asked so that I myself could go and cut it down for the
Oh,
paperback and the ebook. So I wouldn't have to, ask
yeah, yeah, yeah.
for those things. So just little things you can kind of do to to try to make it work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just spent like for my one of my novellas, I just spent like probably 10 hours this weekend going over where one of my friends, CT Phillips, like sent me. It's like I go to this website and I'm like, okay. So I went to I'm like, oh, I found one for like $45. I think it worked for my novella. I'm like, I know I'm not gonna sell a lot of them. I'm doing like 3 prequel novellas for my Monster Hunter. And I was like, eventually, once my other stuff gets out there, I was like, I'll do an anthology and do a really cool cover. But I was
Mhm.
like, $45 is totally fine. I just need something to kind of, with the genre to kind of sell. But yeah, I think anytime you can cut costs like that, and then put your eggs, more of your eggs in that one basket or, for something like that, something like her art, I think that, makes total
Yeah.
sense. But yeah, it's always fun being an indie author trying to figure out all the expenses and everything. But my friend said, he goes, we're just gonna go to like New York City and like hold up your books and a sign and be like, I am an indie author, please help me. And he's like, we'll just stay there for the weekend with some buddies and we'll just do that. We'll see how many books we can sell and stuff
Oh,
like
that's so
that.
funny.
But, yeah. I was like, well, I don't know. I was like, I don't know if we can carry that many. It's like, now my friend's got a cart, we'll be fine. He's like, got a little wagon. He goes, we'll just go around New York City. He's like, we'll just dress like you normally do, and hopefully people feel sorry for
Yeah.
you.
And you should film it and like put the video up for marketing purposes.
That would actually be really cool. I didn't consider. I'm actually so excited because we're going to 3 Comic Cons for the podcast this summer, and we will be. That's one thing we're going to send out in the newsletter
Mhm.
for the podcast for authors. We're going to be like, hey, we're going to this, Comic Con, and anybody who wants to send us 3 signed copies, we'll raffle them off, and
No, it's a
we
great
got
idea.
iPads and stuff, yeah, that we're renting, and we will be. So when we know who the 5 authors are, like 5 or 6, we'll get those set up ahead of time. So Josiah Russell actually just did this recently, where he had set up a really cool giveaway. So we'll set it up on the iPad, so that way, like if you're one of the authors, we'll do like your Twitter, Facebook, whatever, your newsletter. Obviously, is the big one, Amazon profile, things like that, and you'll get like
Mhm.
5 raffle tickets. For doing each of those. And then we'll probably have the podcast as one on like one of the platforms or whatever. But yeah, so it'll be cool to, but we're going to film the whole thing. We got a friend who's not just going to come with his phone. He's going to come with his actual camera, and we're going to interview people and stuff. So yeah, pretty excited there to edit and cut that up. So I think it'll be really cool for people. But all right. So
Mhm.
for the 7th one there, speaking of building your brand, I gotta say, when I saw your covers, I was like, that's how you build a brand. And then when I went to your website and then, I was checking things out there, and I'm looking at reviews and things like that, I'm checking out your blurbs. I felt like you built your brand up pretty well, pretty quickly. So I was just curious, when it comes to building your brand as an author, what do you find most important?
So especially as an indie author, there are a lot of decisions that we face that we have to decide, right? Um, should I do KU or go wide? What should the cover look like? What should the blurb look like? How should you market the book? What should I price the book? We have a lot of decisions
Everything.
we have to make. And I think that the most important question that you can kind of ask yourself that will help you answer all the other ones is who is my target audience?
Mm,
So for example, the kind of the common wisdom on the internet for fantasy authors starting out is to focus on KU and then transition wide later in your career, right?
yep, yep.
And this makes a lot of sense for fantasy because KU pays by the page and fantasy books tend to have a high page count. So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of keeps a reader reading. So it makes sense. But I chose wide right out of the gate.
Mm,
And this is because my target audience is different than most indie fantasy authors. And my target audience are specifically BIPOC readers and readers who are intentionally reading diverse fantasy. So because of my target audience, not only being accessible was important to me, but I also wanted to be available to a wider number of foreign markets. And I also wanted to have more control over how I conducted sales and discounts as well, because I want to make sure that My books are also affordable when I want them to be affordable
Yeah.
to my audience.
Oh, yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
yeah. Second, for example, covers. If you look in the indie space, my book tends to stand out like a
Yeah.
sore thumb in group graphics.
Yep.
But that's because I'm not marketing towards general epic fantasy readers like most indie authors are. I'm marketing toward readers who tend to read traditional published books, who are fans of like The Blood Trials, Iron Widow, Legendborn, Raybearer, The Sunbearer Trials, Blood Scion, right? Like, and what do all those books have in common? They all have a main character on the cover.
Yep.
And why is this? Because, you know, in an industry with a historic lack of, seeing that diversity on your bookshelf matters.
Yeah.
So it's hilarious because I had actually underestimated initially how much it mattered.
Mm.
So the general wisdom in the self-publishing community is to focus on marketing the ebook because it's cheaper to produce and you generally receive a higher royalty in return.
Yeah.
So authors generally seeing more ebook sales than paperback sales. So color me surprised when I launched the book and the reverse happened. Um,
I want
my
both.
target,
I want both. I'll do the ebook to help you out, but I need them. I need them. I need them physically
yeah,
for my bookshelf. Like they're just too
yeah.
important.
My target audience thought the cover was really cool and they were buying the paperbacks. And
Oh,
like
that's
I had
awesome.
accidentally priced the paperback books so close to printing costs, I didn't make any money off of them
Oh,
initially because I didn't know any better. But you know,
yeah,
mistakes and lessons were learned.
yeah, yeah.
But I honestly didn't think anyone other than my family would buy the paperbacks. Like that's why I had done it for them. But here there were random internet strangers buying my books. So like to this day, I've made the exact same royalties off of my ebooks as my paperbacks. And even my
Wow.
second book, I have sold twice as many paperbacks as the ebooks. So target
Oh,
audience matters.
yeah. Wow, you really got me considering some things really differently here, because I feel like you
Right,
and I are very similar, like genre, in terms of fantasy. So yeah, that's
right.
really interesting.
So second thing, for example, price, right? I had initially priced the ebook for Bones to Win for $4.99 out of the gate, which again, most indie authors are like, that's crazy. They'll start with like 99 cents or, like start it with free at the beginning to kind of get the ball rolling, things like that. But the majority of epic fantasy BIPOC readers, they're reading traditionally published books simply because in comparison to traditional publishing, when you're talking about BIPOC books, BIPOC fantasy by BIPOC authors, there's not as many in the indie space as there is
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
traditionally published space, right? So
Yeah,
that's kind of where they are. And at the same time, I'm not talking about romance or urban fantasy or paranormal. Those are different genres, and those
yeah,
tend to be more indie heavy, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm talking about specifically epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, like the big those big genres. Um, and I suspect this is the case because BIPOC fantasy books are simply more visible traditionally by traditional publishers. So
Yeah, yeah.
even if we do have indie books, they tend to not be as visible. Like we do have great indie books in this sphere, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
you think of like Gunmetal Gods
Yeah, yeah,
by
yeah,
Sunil
yeah.
Akhtar or Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty or Tether Spirits by T.A. Hernandez
Oh,
or The Drowned Kingdom, P.L. Stewart, Seventh
yeah.
Cadence, Jim Wilburn, like they are there, but they still aren't as visible as the traditionally published books,
Yeah,
right? Um, and because of it, like this is an audience that tend to be used to paying for books at a higher price,
yeah,
right? Like traditionally published ebooks are like $10, $11.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, so
Yeah,
I so that's why I was more comfortable pricing my book at $4.99.
yeah, yeah.
And at the same time, I was more intentional in seeking out early reviewers and ARC readers to kind of help give the book legitimacy when it launched.
I have
Um,
never considered that in terms of the price for the like traditionally published e-price books. I've never considered that. That's actually a really good point.
Yeah. Or for example, the blurb. I was also very intentional with the way I crafted the blurb. And
Hmm.
I do think it also does a very good job of attracting the readers who might like the book. Um, I also intentionally put in the blurb what I like to call do not pass goes. So for example, you'll never find a curse word in a traditionally published blurb, right? But I intentionally added one into the blurb of the book because one of the main characters frequently curses in the book. I'm sure you can guess. I'm sure you can guess who it is.
Cusses like a sailor, right?
Yes, yes. And so, like, if someone has a problem with that reading the blurb, then this book is obviously not for them. And it does a very good job of weeding out people who have problems with curses. And so I
Yeah.
don't usually get those type of reviews, right? Like, don't pass go.
I don't know if you've seen like Red Bruno and them, like where they had cold as hell, and like the guy on the cover looks like he swears, and it's called cold as hell, and they had some very particular type of readers who are like, well, this was 1 out of 5, this was awful, I couldn't
Yeah.
get past the first page, and he's like, it's called cold as hell. There's a sheriff on the front. Like, did you think it was going to be a clean book? Like, so
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Or another one of my like do not pass goes is being intentional. I'm mentioning that the book contains queer representation because if people have a problem with that, then they have a problem with a lot of things in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is a very liberal and progressive book, and I intentionally crafted the blurb to weed out people who this book might not be for, and that
Smart.
is really what a blurb should be for.
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of people they write blurbs in intent to reach the most widest audience possible. But my intention is to really find the reader who will like the book. And I think the reviews that I've received so far has shown that I've been successful in doing that. Because a lot of the times, books aren't for everyone, right? And just receiving different reviews just means it might not be landing with the right audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, in conclusion, determining your audience is important. And do not be afraid to do something different than the general wisdom if it makes sense for your target audience.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's really smart. I never considered that for a blurb. Yeah, that's really cool. We'll check that out. You guys are not writing notes down in the audience. I don't know what to tell you. You're like missing gold right now. I like ran out of notes on my pad. I have to get another one later. That's a good sesh right there. Well, that's awesome. I think that's really smart. I have not seen somebody do that, craft their blurb exactly like that, or with that general idea. And I think that makes total sense because, like you said, first of all, any review is a good review, but like I know some people, like I said, they get bombed right now because nobody can, some of these certain people can't make it past, the first couple of pages. And, I think that they thought it was going to be a different type of book. So I think maybe if they had done what you did, a couple of different times on the blurb or whatever, I think that would actually help them, in the long run. So I think that that's really smart.
Yeah. And even, have like, and even throughout the book a little bit, like the epithet is very obvious, like, okay, this is the type of book we're getting. Just try to be obvious on what this book is like is
Yeah.
about.
Well, that makes sense too for like, your, and I was just like thinking too, like maybe even, like maybe not even like to, I'm just thinking like like the sample that you're giving as well, I think makes a really big difference, and
Mhm.
if you're doing chapter one or a prologue or something like that, I know some people, are really intentional with that as well. So, that might even be a good way too, if you're having trouble crafting a really good blurb that does that, maybe even think about that for the first, couple pages, that sample or what you're putting in there, maybe that's a good indication as well for somebody, when they're reading that sample. But
Yeah. There's several little like things I do. I kind of do with the blurb. For example, the way it's crafted is actually crafted kind of like a romance novel,
mm,
where, as you know, one the first paragraph is from like one of the characters' point of view, and the second paragraph is from the other character's point of view. But because rivals trope, and I couldn't find any, where can I go to
yeah,
figure out how to write a blurb for it? Like I used that format to write the blurb to represent the rival trope that I was going for. And even there's a third character and third main character in the book, but I don't talk about him in the marketing. I don't mention him in the blurb, and there is a particular plot reason why.
That's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. I have to check that out. I'm really excited to read book one to see all these things. My friend said that the other day. He goes, we don't read a lot of these books. I said, there is no way with writing as much as I write that we will read everybody's books. I said, I would like to eventually. I said, it helps me with my reading list. And I review all of them, and I will be doing a bunch after I'm done with this season, and we'll be putting them out this spring. I had a lot of notes and things on the books I did read, particularly for indie. But I'm like, I said, part of the thing too, I said, it's almost like I get a director's cut, like in the process. And then I go and read, because I've done that a lot with my friends where then I read their book and then I go back and do the second interview with them. I'm like, well, what about this? And
oh, that's interesting.
It honestly, it helps so much because seeing where you conceptualize these ideas just helps me out more when I'm reading, your book, to then be like, oh, okay, that makes total sense. And I've just gotten such a better, like if I could literally set up a, an interview with every author, like I have Deborah Dunbar right now, urban fantasy. I just love her Dead Rising book. I wish that I had talked to her ahead of time to see how she did her world building and then read it, because I'm loving it right now. But I'm like, oh, that's a missed opportunity as a writer, because as a reader, I've noticed a lot of things and stuff. But yeah, it's definitely been helping me out a lot when it comes to having a better reading experience. I kind of feel like I have a secret, or like I, got told, the quid pro quo ahead of time. But yeah, it's been giving me a much better reading experience. And then afterwards, I have a much better writing experience. So it's helped me out quite a bit. So I do a little bit differently than other like podcast hosts, but I get so many cool books like yours, on my Kindle, and then I can go through and, and check out a lot of different things. And as a writer, I just feel like it's a much better experience. So highly recommend it to people if you're starting a podcast. But well, that's awesome. For that last one, do you have any news, updates, promos, current projects that you'd like to share with us, even if they're secret and you can't mention the names or anything? Or
Okay. So the duology is finished, and I kind of really wanted to take a break from this world. I do think I'm going to kind of come back to it eventually and write some standalones. But I want to take a break. So I decided to work to do this novella. And because I also wanted to have something smaller and something at a smaller price point to offer people to introduce them to me as well.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about it. Have you watched the anime Afro Samurai at all?
Oh, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. Yep.
So I'm writing a female version of it.
Oh, and that's cool.
Yeah, extremely excited.
Oh, that's cool. Well, you sold the pre-order already, because that sounds awesome. Write that down. That is cool. Well, when you have that ready, you're going to have to come back on. We'll have to talk about that, because that just sounds amazing.
Yeah, like it's just a very, very specific genre, again, that I haven't seen very much narratively. Comic books, yes, but in narrative form, not as much.
Oh, yeah, it's really cool. It's interesting that you bring that up, though, because somebody else and I, we were just talking about that, and I'm totally blanking on the anime that her and I were talking about. But she said that. She's like, well, I had this idea from this anime, and then this idea, and then I decided to put it together. And she's like, there's clearly a market, because, this is a huge anime, and totally blanking on which one it was. But I was just like, yeah, that makes total sense. And I'm like, why didn't I think of that? I'm like, I think that's how a lot of different genres have been opened up, particularly in indie and
right.
Sci-Fi, is people like, oh, well, what do people like? And then I'll do this, like the Cameron Johnson with the Maleficent Seven, like that's a great example. Like people love fairy tales and mythology. Why not, turn it on its head? And I think a lot of people have done that then, and I think that, there's a lot of graphic novels. I think like, Jeffrey H. Haskell with his his different superhero novels has done a really good job with that. Like that clearly was a big thing, but there weren't a lot of superhero novels. So he was able, to do a lot with both of his female characters and build really cool worlds. So I think that's a really good idea. I think that's a great marketing strategy right there, because you already know who your audience is. Now, you find those, particular algorithms on, Amazon. I think that worked really well. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, and especially like the generation has grown up and raised with anime, right? Like they're already familiar with the tropes, they're already familiar with archetypes. We just like, yeah, cross them over.
Well, there's so many of my female students too love anime, like love anime, like, um, and there's so many and like draw anime. I mean, I have some
Yeah.
amazing female artists in my classes. I'm always like, can you please do something with your art? I'm like, that you've been given a gift, come on. Like, I'm like, I know this industry. I'm like, I know there's not enough of you. I'm like, just get out there, do your thing. I'm like, I know plenty of, female artists that, I can help, contact you with them, and you guys will just fly off into space and do really well. But yeah, I think, you market to, that particular crowd. I think, you could totally sell out of your paperbacks again, Yeah, so yeah, that's a really good idea. I like how you said too about the price point, like having something, a little smaller where they get a sample of, your writing,
Mhm.
your style. I think that's what I'm doing. I think that makes total sense. I think is really smart. So yeah, that's cool. Anything else that you had to share with us? That's a really cool one right there.
No, that's it. That's what I'm
Perfect.
working on.
I like how we end with Afro female samurai. That sounds
Yes.
awesome. If you guys need anything other than that, this is not the podcast for you. That's all. Well, Tatiana, it was a pleasure. I knew we were gonna have a great conversation. I can just feel at this point, when I see somebody's website, their book covers, and then when I read their blurbs, I'm like, okay, I'm like, we're gonna have a really good conversation. So glad to see I was right. If there's, anything else that we can do for you in the meantime, let me know if you have, any sales, or, you just, over the holidays, you're like, oh, I really want to get more of these, paperbacks sold or something like that. Just
Okay.
send me the link, and I'll share it everywhere that we can and try to help you out. In the description, just want to remind everybody, if you're new to this podcast, we always put Tatiana's and all the other authors social links, place where you can find their books, in the description. So please make sure you click there. You can go right there, buy the books right away. Season 2, we're really trying to emphasize, please make sure authors like Tatiana, once you have, gobbled up those products, whether it's Audible, book, or, the paperbacks, hardcovers, whatever, please make sure you're reviewing those. That way Tatiana can write more, and then we can get her on here and chit chat more about her writing in her world. So, but Tatiana, again, thank you so much for coming. Like I said, if
Oh,
there's anything
thank
else,
you for having me.
yeah, anytime you want to come and, chit chat about Dragonlance or Afro, whatever, just let me know and we'll get you on. Don't forget, I will be sending out that email about the
Okay.
newsletter. We will be trying to get, multiple of the authors on at a time in the winter. We'll do like a 2-hour slot, and we'll do 2 different episodes. If we go longer, it might be 3 episodes from that one little seminar that we'll have, and we'll send you the questions and the topic ahead of time, so you'd be ready to go. So I think you'd be a perfect fit for those. So I'll send you ones that maybe you'd be interested in. So
Okay, thank you.
we have a great rest of the evening, and I will talk to you later, my friend.
Okay, you too.
See you
Bye.
later.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Yeah, of course.